Today's topic, or at least the title of this thing, was chosen to be a bit provocative. Data mining is a tool, and this conversation will probably be more about a tool than any specific application in contrast to some of the previous lecture series. Right now we're in a very primitive era of data mining techniques, and I suspect over the next 100 years or so we'll see the then state of the art compared back to today, kind of like the Nimitz class aircraft carrier would be compared to a crude dugout canoe. And that's where we're at the moment, I suspect, in that dugout. Again, the title was chosen to reflect a little bit of what I call the Howard Cosell syndrome. Now, only a certain group of you are going to remember Howard Cosell, a sports announcer who was either very well loved by some or despised by others. There's very little gray area in between. And data mining as a technique has endured a bit of a period where it was also viewed very dichotomously, either love or hate, with very little in between that was tolerable. One of the, gotta watch all the cords up here. One of the provoking books in the recent decades is Naisbitt's popular book on megatrends, which has as an undercurrent, one of its general themes, the proliferation of data in so many aspects of our lives, to the extent that we're being inundated with raw data. And we have to confront the issue of, do we come to grips with this somehow? Do we take control of the data so that we can convert it into useful information to support decision making? Or do we just start floundering and risk drowning in this sea of unmanageable raw data? One tool among many that helps us take a little bit of control over the data is called data mining. And this is a very practical definition of data mining from Raytheon that you'll find I tend to use synonymous with the phrase pattern recognition. So as this discussion unfolds, sometimes you'll just hear me refer to data mining, and sometimes you'll hear me refer to pattern recognition. I'm fundamentally using them synonymously. Purists would find a difference, but hopefully that's not necessary for this discussion. In other words, can we look at case-based data and start to identify recurring patterns in the data that might help us lead to a recorded outcome for that historical data? And if so, then is that something that would help us have a better understanding of some of the cause and effect implications and help us make better decisions? As a tool, it has a very eclectic application area. I'm going to mention a couple of things that may or may not be legible. It doesn't look like the blue is coming through very well there. At least for a second, I'm going to lump together an auto mechanic and a physician. They both listen to your symptoms about something that's wrong. They will both conduct formal tests to collect some quantitative data to support the qualitative data that they got from your description of the symptoms. They'll synthesize that, and then they'll hopefully make an educated diagnosis. Now I'll shift to the physician and get away from the auto mechanic, and hopefully being able to diagnose whether you have esophageal cancer or just chronic heartburn. I don't want my auto mechanic making that distinction, but the physician could. That's an application area of pattern recognition where there's a diagnosis or a classification being involved. Just a few days ago, Professor Dustin Moore, no relation, he and I were chatting a little bit about the need to start detecting some of the underlying patterns in all of the assessment of student learning data that we're collecting as a campus, and see if we can identify recurring patterns in that before we simply get inundated, overwhelmed with massive quantities of raw data. Many of you were here 2 weeks ago when Professor Samavati led to discussion about bank robberies. Now, as I recall, her dependent variable was pretty much binary. The bank is either robbed or it is not robbed, 1 and 0. What if that dependent variable had been truly categorical? So I'm just going to make up a few things here. What if she was trying to identify banks that get robbed at gunpoint while they're open versus banks that get robbed when they're closed? I happened to see a movie right after you talked about somebody tunneling underneath a bank and coming up through the floor. And so that made me think of that particular permutation. Banks that are robbed by insider manipulation of the books, or banks that are not robbed. Now all of a sudden I've got a categorical dependent variable that's not just simply binary, it's a little more awkward to work with. Or what if in, again, Professor Samavati's situation, she had a variable, I don't believe you did, but what if there was something about the security provision for the bank? And it was qualitative, not numeric, but qualitative. Maybe the bank had armed security guards, or maybe it had some kind of electronic surveillance, or maybe it had androids from Terminator movies, or several combinations of those kinds of things. Or maybe no security at all, which is almost what I'm seeing when I witness these branches develop in retail stores. In supermarkets, you see a branch of a bank or a financial institution in there, and the only security they seem to have is just the fact that the building is open and there's a lot of traffic flowing around. Qualitative driver variables mean that we can start to use different techniques that aren't necessarily the standard deterministic tools or stochastic tools. There's a fairly extensive and growing inventory of tools that fit into data mining, at least at the umbrella level, some of which are actually able to do some kind of internal repetitive refinement of their classification process. The genetic algorithm and the neural net fit that particular description. Well, I'm not prepared to talk about any of these today. I'm going to talk about a different one, there it comes, called rule induction. And rule induction, like some of the others, seeks to identify recurring patterns in the data that lead to historic outcomes, and then if the pattern holds, maybe we can use that for future cases. So it's designed to give us a feel for the relative importance of each of the contributing factors, but as well it's designed to help us in the sequencing of how those factors flow one after another to reach a conclusion, a decision, or an outcome. Not all factors are going to be relevant to all branches of the tree. One of the nice things about this technique is that its deliverable is a visual aid, a decision tree. And as the tree unfolds, it doesn't have to have the same contributing factors on all branches. It's just whatever it needs will be found there. And so there are some advantages to rule induction, and that's the thing I'm going to talk about for a few minutes here. This is based on some work done 20 plus years ago by a fellow named Quinlan, developed the conceptual idea of a screening mechanism, if you will, for factors. Again, it's going to look at large sets of case-based data. Is everybody familiar with that language? Just lots of cases. Envision a spreadsheet, if you will, and each row of the spreadsheet's a different case, but they all have common columns, common features, attributes. And it's looking for patterns among those columns that are consistent with the many, many cases that lead to an outcome that I'll position way over here on the spreadsheet, a decision or an outcome. I love optimizations. That's what I teach in the MBA program, is optimization modeling. And so this particular technique has twofold interest for me because there are two elements of optimization contained within it. This would be a good time for those of you that are bored to fall asleep, and we'll wake you up in a few minutes because this is going to be a bit of a technical digression. The first is that the algorithm that's used here will seek to minimize the number of factors necessary to reach the outcome, to reach the decision, so it doesn't get all cluttered. The second minimization is that it's involving some formal metric, some formal measure of the concept of uncertainty. Usually that's a very elusive thing that we never can get our hands around too well. But this technique does measure something called entropy, which is just a fancy 25-cent word for uncertainty. In this case, it's the uncertainty about how a particular variable has an influence on some outcome. Let me give you a kind of a silly example here. A coin flip. Now, if it's a fair coin, you have no way of predicting whether you're going to get a head or a tail. And so it's certainly got an awful lot of uncertainty about it. That's the maximum case. Versus the two-headed coin, hopefully I know where all of you would place your money if somebody's flipping a two-headed coin, because there is no uncertainty about that outcome. So it has zero entropy, zero uncertainty, versus the first case, which has the greatest amount of uncertainty in a coin flip. Now, this is an extreme case where things are all or none, if you will, and that's not likely to happen in anything else, but at least it gives you a little bit of a feel for that funny word, entropy. Translate it to uncertainty and you'll be a little better off, I suspect. What the algorithm seeks to do is rank the potential attributes, the potential factors, by this metric, this entropy measure. And then find those that have the most discriminating power, hence the least amount of entropy, and position them in the decision tree very early on. Then revise all the metrics, change all the measurements. So there is some similarity here for those of you that have a recall of Bayesian probability revision. There is some of that taking place in here. But it's rank ordering the attributes on an as-needed basis, depending upon what has come before and how much uncertainty there still is to arrive at the ultimate decision, which I've got positioned way over here. There's a nice little calculation that's involved, and this will be assigned as homework over the weekend, and you can all bump and grind through a variety of numbers here, but that's not the purpose of today's discussion. Please submit your reports to Professor Diltz, and he'll be grading them on Monday. Okay, let's take an example. So those of you that dozed off through that, that's fine. This is the time to wake up again. Here is a rather simplistic case of a creditor looking at three attributes, three issues that might help determine whether or not credit is extended or not. So again, on the far right side is the ultimate outcome or decision. To the left of that are three columns that represent issues that conceptually this decision maker has said ought to play a bearing on the decision we make. You want to begin with a conceptual model that makes some sense. And this person has said, well, okay, the presence of a steady job for this applicant, that ought to be important. The adequacy of his collateral, that ought to be important. And the adequacy of his regular income ought to be important. Now I've got three factors, each of which is binary, and so I've got 2 to the third or 8 combinations, and they're all there. That's an exhaustive list of rows. So those 8 cases are all there ever be. And then over there on the far right is whether the loan is granted or not. Now, if you just built a decision tree without the tool that I'm referring to, you'd get something that is a bit bushy. It has 8 different paths through there. The red represents the turn down of the credit. The yellow-green, colors do an awful lot of distortion here, represent the loan being approved. It's a very inefficient tree because it's got far too many branches compared to what it needs to have, and far too many nodes, that's the little circles up there, for what it needs to have. In contrast, if we were to take that same data, nothing's been changed, it's still that same set of 8 cases, and subject it to the algorithm that I've been referring to that is built upon this metric of uncertainty. It's going to come up with a much more concise decision tree to get you from left to right to help make the decision. And so that's what this tool is capable of doing, giving you the smallest set of paths and variables. In this case, all the variables were required, but the most parsimonious, I love that word, I can't spell it, I can say it, tree. Okay, remember in the 3rd grade how you all got to write that infamous essay, How I Spent My Summer? Well, this is my permutation of that, of how I spent my fall. I was on sabbatical last fall and investigating a particular interest that's kind of dear to me in the business school. Can I predict anything about the success of our undergraduate business students using this technique? Now, originally I had the rather naive hope of having the categorical dependent variable be, yes, they're successful, they graduate, or they transfer away, or they drop out while they're still in good academic standing, or they're academically dismissed. And I was hoping that that would be driven by some combination of factors that's available on the student's application for admission to the university, or their academic performance in the freshman and sophomore years. The business school is pretty much a junior-senior curriculum, and so students have to be then accepted into that junior-senior curriculum at the end of their sophomore year, at the start of their junior year. And that's where this particular model was intended to step in and hopefully help all of us in the business school identify students at risk, so that maybe an active intervention could turn a poor prognosis into a better prognosis for an individual student. Well, the first thing I uncovered when I had about well over 1,000 cases drawn anonymously, so there was no way of identifying who the student was in a particular case, not drawn by me, in fact, drawn by Bill Baden, was that those 2 outcomes I really was somewhat interested in, of dropping out or transferring, dropping out while in good academic standing or transferring away, just simply weren't tied well at all to the factors that are on the transcript. I'm guessing that they're probably driven by an awful lot of personal issues that weren't on the record. So I had to collapse the model down to just look at those people that were successful in achieving the BSB degree, that's the Bachelor of Science in Business, or those that were academically dismissed, the 2 polar extremes. Had about 600 cases. A whole host of attributes came off of the admission application and or the transcript for the freshman and sophomore years. But the algorithm sifts through all that stuff and says, I'm going to identify the most interesting of those attributes in terms of their discriminatory power based upon this thing called entropy. And let's see if I can point this contraption or not. There we go. The far left side of the decision tree is a variable called student type, and it's really just distinguishing between traditional students and non-traditional students. And non-traditional students are the adults, those with a GED degree, and students that have laid out and come back, returning students. Whereas the traditional student, the one that comes directly from high school, or the transfer student, is the pretty concise summary of traditional. It chooses that to bifurcate the first branch of the model. Then it looks at the entropy, recalculates everything for the, there we go, for the 2 branches. Right there is now an admit type. And that's distinguishing between those that are admitted directly out of high school and those that are coming in as transfer students. I was kind of impressed, and it was serendipity, that there, and there was a role for the pre-core GPA. Students take a predetermined set of courses before being admitted into the business school. It's all at the freshman and sophomore level, of course. And how well they do on that really determines whether or not they do get admitted into the business school as a junior. But independently, that same variable came up as the next driver, the next most important driver after the type of student involved. Now, it's got different numeric thresholds involved with it. The algorithm, not the investigator, the algorithm determines what those numeric thresholds are to distinguish between this fork in the road and that fork in the road. Notice that a student that's a traditional student directly out of high school and has a pre-core GPA in excess of 2.5 and change has a very good chance of graduating. Notice down here at the bottom that a student that's non-traditional has a pre-core GPA of anything has a very limited opportunity to graduate. There's only one outcome in there that's going to work for those students. 3 out of the 4 are, academic dismissal. So that might be an identification of some academically at-risk students where an intervention could help. And through the middle, traditional student, transfer student, well, the prognosis is really only good for those that transfer from within the system. Those that come to us from outside the IU system seem to be having much more difficulty than those that come within. So this is a preliminary investigation. It's going to be followed up. Professor Kamala is going to use the same data with a neural net, and then we'll compare the results. We'll see if the technique does, one technique uncovers something that the other one misses. This particular model was built with half of the data cases. The other cases were prohibited from the algorithm seeing, and they are held out so that the validity of the model can be tested on those other cases. So the next slide is going to look a little busy. There we go. But this is an attempt to validate how well that particular decision tree does in working with cases it hasn't seen before. The previous decision tree continues to be developed until all of the cases in the training set are satisfied correctly. But now we subject it to a holdout sample that it hasn't seen before. Over here on the far left is the actual description of the case. Across the top is how it was predicted. Here's a direct admit from high school that actually graduated. There were 88 of them. Got 82 of them right for cases it had never seen before. So that's a hit rate of something in excess of 93%. The green primary diagonal cells are all good things. Those are hits that are correct classifications. The shaded gray off diagonal cells, and there's 3 over here and 3 up here, are just plain errors. So this is also a form of error analysis. And we've got a few instances where the hits aren't all that great. I see one right here. Graduated as a non-traditional student. There were 14 to begin with in the holdout set. We only got 7 of them right. The other 7 happened to be classified as dismissed cases when in fact they were people that graduated. So that's a lousy 50% hit rate there. Below that, there's a one that's pretty darn good again. Here's somebody that was academically dismissed as a transfer student. There were, oh boy, I can't even read that. It looks like 61 instances in the holdout sample, and we got 58 of them right. So in excess of 95% hit rate. Overall, and this is probably comparing apples and oranges and kiwi and everything else, you get a hit rate in excess of 88%, which if you can tolerate fruit salad, it's a way of gauging the collective accuracy of the whole thing. Okay, so I guess I'm prepared to start drawing some conclusions. Obviously, I have a bias in this, so you have to wade through that bias. Like most tools, they can be used properly or they can be abused. And it's really up to the investigator and how he or she works with the tool as to whether or not it is black magic or good science. I'm convinced that if the investigator doesn't have some kind of a priori conceptual model of how variables ought to be linked, or if the investigator treats the tool as simply a black box, you do have black magic. You have a tool that is probably warranting the label of, well, this is just a fishing expedition and ought not be given any great credibility. Alternatively, if the investigator has an underpinning, some kind of grounding in a conceptual model, and isn't afraid to say, well, this variable is not behaving the way it should, I'll discount it. I'll take it out of the model. We do that with ordinary least squares all the time. Take variables out that are misbehaving to try and get a more refined model. And you have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to do the validation after the fact to see if you've got something that does satisfy your conceptual underpinnings, how good's its performance? You're always going to get an output. You're always going to get a decision tree. Just like a simple regression is always going to come back with some specification and some resulting set of coefficients. But how good are they? And so here we have to have a mechanism for testing. That's a list of things I've been involved with over recent years that probably reflects a little bit of my own bias. If we begin with the old stuff at the bottom, at the bottom, and skip over and hit that one and that one and that one, and then skip over and hit that one, you'll notice that those things all have a financial side to them. From the bottom up, there's property valuation. Then in the middle, there's capital appreciation of growth firms, and then the two above that are involved with relative performance of funds, corporate bond funds, and above it's equity mutual funds. And then the most recent thing at the top is kind of a complement to Professor Samavati's topic of banks. These aren't banks that are getting robbed, these are banks that are failing. Identifying banks that have better survival practices during the so-called Great Recession of 8 and 9. Then going back to the ones I skipped over, here was an interesting piece done with Professor Shipchandler that enabled me to learn an awful lot about international business. And so the tool covers all bases. And so it's just a matter of what are you willing to be educated about. And the same story up here with Professor Diltz. I knew nothing about labor arbitration. I can spell labor, but I can't spell arbitration. I can now, but only because we did that work that was kind of valuable. And so it's an excellent way for some cross-fertilization of ideas. There's a few current things that you might find interesting for general reference. None of those are difficult to read. All of those are things that people could use to just get an overview of the tools and techniques of data mining. I think I'm running out of things to say, so I guess I'd like to get your comments and your questions and see how evasive I can be. Heather.
Jim, I think that the data mining techniques are like the biggest thing right now in like security and all of the information that say Homeland Security and all use huge centers that people are doing 24/7 only this stuff. Can you comment?
Well, things go through popularity in cycles, and I think this is one that is currently rather popular in some circles. So, yeah, it's, I hate to say fashionable, but almost in that context. I'm not sure if that addressed your question or not.
I was amazed. I didn't know much about it, though.
There's a whole host of data mining techniques, and I only referenced one here. You know, I mentioned some others in passing, and so they all kind of take their turn in the hot button seat, if you will. I like the one I just discussed because of the visual nature of the deliverable, and you can look back and say, does this make sense? I'm a little concerned with things like the genetic algorithm that might not necessarily give you any ready interpretation of just what is the relative influence of the factors. And so, different end results, I guess, whatever you're after.
Does your decision tree have any uncertainty in its own outcomes? Say if you were to have a very, very large set to where 90% of the people who had a certain GPA and were a certain age were to graduate, well, there's no distinction between that special 10% and the other 90%. Is that factored in, or do those just come out as wrong answers?
When the tree is built, everything is correct. All the cases must fit, and so it'll keep bumping and grinding until it finds a way, or simply says, I've got something here that could go either way and don't know, based upon the factors that you've provided me with. So that's an awareness exercise that says maybe you've inadequately made provision for some variables. You've misspecified the model. So you go back and you say, okay, I need to collect some more data, some more factors for these cases so that it can make a definitive conclusion.
So they're all 100% correct.
When the tree is built, all the cases will fit the tree, or it'll still be cycling, it'll still be running. It won't quit. The acid test then is when you do the validation with the holdout sample. Rest
That
adults.
first example you used, Jim, with the going back and looking at students and their success rates. I wonder if something like that couldn't be used to look at individual courses and how they contribute to their success rate?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, could that be broadened in some fashion to do curricular assessment?
Probably. I'm not sure I want to go down that path, but yeah, you can certainly look at an individual course.
I can understand why you hesitant, because then you'd wind up with that additional duty, but if Joseph's gonna do neural networks, you develop it and we'll let Joseph implement it.
You can do this at a more specific level than at the program level, which is what I did there. You could do it for any particular concentration, much less an individual course, as you mentioned. So,
Is the data there for that sort of?
well, you'd have to collect a new dependent variable, because right now the only one that was collected here was, did they graduate or not?
It might point out to us what courses aren't getting the job done and what courses are actually differentiating between success and not success. And that might provide some useful information.
Mm-hmm.
That rule induction, I think. The other thing I was going to ask you about, Posner and those guys back in the 70s and 80s when they started doing law and economics big time were using things like path analysis and some of the other multivariate statistical techniques. It seems to me that your rule induction model lends itself very well to that law and economics paradigm. Have you thought about doing much more in that area?
The nice thing about rule induction is it's neither a deterministic tool nor a stochastic tool per se, and so it doesn't have the same data requirements that a statistical technique would have. You know, some naive assumptions about univariate normality and all that kind of stuff just go out the window. You just need to have good representative cases. And so it's a lot more flexible in that regard. So some of those works that you cited, we're kind of laying some of the groundwork for what can we do to get away from truly a stochastic technique that might give us more flexibility in dealing with some of the qualitative variables. Susan.
I was just trying to remember, when you were setting up the factors and things, didn't you also include some specific courses?
Oh, yes.
And then none of those really came up as...
The original model for the student prognosis there had 35 some odd variables as potential drivers. And you saw that when that tree was up there, there was only a half a dozen of them that made any difference. And so it's just weeding out what it needs to weed out to get down to a set of variables that will get it from start to finish with the training set. Again, you need to make sure that the variables that it chooses satisfy some conceptual model that you have in a background rather than let it be a fishing expedition. Please.
On your final model, you had an accuracy of predictions of something like 80% or so. Was that high or low, or was that a normal percentage of accuracy that you had found?
That 88%, which we had there, is pretty good. If we can have a prognosis that's that good going in, I think we can feel comfortable that, yeah, we can intervene when need be and let sleeping dogs lie when need be. There was a neural net built about 25 years ago that had a 70% hit rate, and this particular application didn't have anything to do with students. And that was lauded as just a great hit rate at the time. So that's kind of still the benchmark. You refer back to that article frequently in terms of have you crossed a little threshold in the sand about good or bad in terms of the hit rate. Please.
In your data, did you have like socioeconomic data besides just education?
I'm glad you asked that. In that data set for the student thing, there were all kinds of demographic features, some of which you hope don't show up. You'd hate to see gender, ethnicity, and some of those things come into play because that might be indicative of some kind of discriminatory practices taking place. Fortunately, they didn't. The things that were there in that tree were all relevant to academics in some way, shape, or form. The only one that was a demographic was the age over here on one branch, and that was just probably a proxy for maturity. But I would hate to see some kinds of variables show up. I have to include them just so that I can allow for them, but I'm really thankful that they don't sometimes because they don't fit a conceptual model.
I was thinking of, does the student hold a job? A 20-hour-a-week job or, 30-hour-a-week, 40-hour-a-week job?
I don't think that one per se was on the admission record nor the transcript, but we had things like military status. I was kind of expecting the vets to somehow distinguish themselves. Didn't turn out to be a role player at all. Dean.
One time you were, I think, exploring the possibility of using the map work. Yeah, map works and information or subset to as a different, I guess, data or to. Do you think you can rerun this model using the data from a subset?
We could test it with another vehicle, another model, easy enough. We could compare the results, this one versus another one, easy enough. Hasn't been done yet, but could be. Yes?
Speaking of misclassification rate, there are two types of misclassifications. A good student may have been misclassified as being failure. In your model, did you take any consideration of which misclassification is more serious, so minimize the probability of that kind of misclassification?
This is extremely straightforward. The real cases were over here under actual, and the predicted was over here, and it's either you hit it or you missed it. And so with a simple dichotomous outcome, the student either graduated or the student didn't, there isn't much else to consider. If you had a 4-category dependent variable, you might be able to do some more things with it than I was able to do here. And I regret that we didn't find anything interesting about the transfer students and those that drop out while in good academic standing, but I'm personally convinced now that that was just simply due to the fact that the formal transcript doesn't capture those kinds of personal issues that cause people to choose to transfer away or to choose to stop out.
One?
Yes.
Does the awareness of this pattern or models, what effect would that have? I see you have identified a list of traits or patterns that, say, successful student has versus those who dropped out. But
Well, the intent then.
Yeah, when the players, say the students or the administration, is aware of that patterns and act accordingly,
Then when we
what
find a
effect
student
may that have?
in Susan's office back there as the head advisor who doesn't fit a profile that's got a good prognosis, maybe there is still an opportunity for an intervention that would turn that around into a positive outcome rather than an ultimate dismissal outcome. So the intent is really to be able to identify students that are at risk and intervene. Students that don't fit that profile that leads them out to a conclusion that says graduate. That doesn't mean they're not salvageable, it just may mean they need a little extra awareness and more discussions to turn a bad prognosis into a good outcome.
If you were to do that intervention, I guess, I know this would kind of be bad, but if you were to intervene with the troubled students and then get them to graduate, wouldn't that in effect break your tool? You wouldn't be able to, or you'd have to recalculate with the new data, and then that would change and it would make it harder to identify the...
I'm not so sure that the students that you intervene with and turn around, if you will, would need to, or would necessitate taking the tool back to square one. You've recognized them to be the exceptions now.
And you see the intervention is in going forward because what the tool did here was to use historical data. Once those patterns have been recognized, if I read what you're saying correctly, Dr. Moore, is that then it puts the administration in a position to put measures in place that can help students that come in with certain typology, which when an administrator looks at that says, well, they are headed towards not successfully making it. So the history is done. You know, the data that was used to build that cannot be reversed. But going forward,
That makes sense.
I think he's saying that with the intervention going to contaminate future data. If you want to rerun that.
right. But that is a nice thing, isn't it? If we end up with 100% success rate, all the students who come in succeed. Hey,
The model is a means, not an end.
The other thing is you could just add one more variable or one more qualitative factor, which is your intervention, and then maybe then going forward saying this is how my intervention.
Good idea. So if your case was the concern, maybe when you rerun the model, you would have an attribute that says what kind of intervention was used to get that outcome. That would also be an after-the-fact test upon the intervention success, too, because if you had it present and then they did graduate, that's one thing, but if you had the intervention present and they didn't graduate, that's an assessment tool on the intervention itself. Yeah.
Jim, do you write the algorithm for the analysis yourself, or is
No,
there
no.
any software, special software?
There's a piece of software. It's from well, it's 20 years old now. It was from, I'll use the past tense, a small entrepreneurial firm and an incubator in Cambridge, Massachusetts, affiliated with MIT. You know, a fancy version of our NIC. Susan.
So as data mining progresses and becomes more refined and more in-depth, and do you see any potential for this to be used, what do I say, negatively? Like, I don't know, I mean, we'll use our school as an example, not that we would do this, but if we ever established a certain point that said, oh, well, if you don't meet these criteria, you're not going to succeed, so we're not letting you in, you know, or something along those lines you could apply to any different type of industry you're studying.
I would hate to have the system that automated that we didn't have the flexibility to judge each individual somewhat personally. Granted, that's a lot of subjective, but at least to identify the at-risk students, to identify those that seem to be on the fast track, and focus our attention on the group that we'd like to turn around, if you will.
I can just see potential in even like other other settings that.
Like a bank robber.
Yeah.
Well, how far do you want to take profiling?
Yeah, we do that now. We use the graduate record exam or the GMAT, which is an attribute, grade point average, which is an attribute. And if you don't make certain numbers on those things, then you don't get in the MBA program.
But if you're at the margin, you at least get brought before the Graduate Policy Committee to be discussed and say, is there some extenuating circumstance here that's going to cause this person to be admissible versus somebody else that's not? So I'd hate to take that element out of it, that they're.
I can understand this for being here now, information and that it's a cause and effect type of thing. But is it used for a predictor as well?
Well, yeah, that's the whole purpose of
Am I missing that,
this.
is what I'm saying?
That's the whole purpose here, so that we use it in a moving forward context, not necessarily to be an absolute thing, but to help us identify those students that are at academic risk of not graduating. And granted, the model probably needs to be refined and tweaked on a continual basis so that you're not simply relying upon something that was built 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There's probably a structural change taking place someplace. And so you'd want to continually update that model if you are using it as a predictive tool, which is what it's intended to be.
Okay, that makes sense now.
Is there any way to increase the strength of your model aside from giving it more data? I mean, is there anything that you as an investigator can do to tell it to, well, if you maybe change this, it will make a stronger model? Or is it just plug in your data?
Like any other specification, you have to include those attributes that you think have some potential contributing influence. And so you're always asking yourself, are there other things that ought to be brought in? We've heard a few of them brought up here today. So that's how you improve the model. Change the specification or change the buffet of things that you allow it to pick from. Thank you so much, folks. Appreciate it.